for me, the significance of John Blofeld was that his book, The Wheel of Life, is what I see really as the sort of origins of a literary genre that I call Western Buddhist travel narratives. And it's not just the literary genre, it's a way of looking at Buddhism from the West that is really quite different from what went before. And so the clearest way to understand the originality of Blofeld is to consider what preceded him. And that is that Western views of Buddhism were, excuse me, basically outsiders looking at something very exotic, often rather sensationalized, especially anything to do with Tibet, sort of Orientalist with a kind of bias towards this as a primitive culture. And Blofeld's originality then was to approach Buddhism and say, this is something that Westerners might actually get into and learn from and become a Buddhist even. So he took it seriously. And moreover, he, in contrast with some other Western writers, he didn't just discuss it as a system of ideas, as a sort of theology or sort of Eastern equivalent to what we call theology. He was interested in describing the experiences the personal experiences that happened to him when he started to understand the world this way. And that very autobiographical, personal, subjective approach to Buddhism has developed into a huge, as you know, a huge outpouring of more recent works since 1960, say, in which Westerners really try to say what Buddhism has meant to them. Another aspect of Blofeld that I see as really original was the way that he uses the travel narrative form. This genre that I call Western Buddhist travel narratives, here's my book, Journeys of Transformation, explores Blofeld and about 30, 35 later Western writers who I would say basically kind of blend the spiritual autobiography with the travel narrative. And so a geographical journey becomes partly a metaphor for and also kind of interrelated with a spiritual journey of transformation. And that's a really creative move on Blofeld's part that's been picked up by many, many other people. Most of the later people I write about are more focused on a particular journey. The most famous Western Buddhist travel narrative is Peter Mathiessen's The Snow Leopard, which describes one journey he took to Nepal in the early 70s. And that's what most of them do. Blofeld's work, in contrast, is really a spiritual autobiography of his whole life. And it's, of course, selective like any autobiography, but the time frame is much wider. It goes back to childhood and so forth. And some people have picked up on that, but in any case, travel was a huge part of Blofeld's life. And he writes about it in ways that are really interesting and much more interesting than just a kind of dry, this is the Eightfold Path and this is the Four Noble Truths, sort of the sort of dry, abstract approach of many Westerners has its place. But this much more personal, experiential thing is also very powerful. And many Westerners have written sort of how-to manuals about meditation, which are personal, but they're kind of limited to what happens on the cushion. And Blofeld also is really I think radically creative and interesting in the way that he's talking about a lot more than that in his life, than just, certainly more than ideas and more than just Buddhist meditation. But how does taking these Buddhist ideas seriously uh, change experience? Another thing that's really interesting about Blofeld that affects my focus on in this book is his focus on the idea of no self, uh, which is an idea that for many Westerners is sort of appealing, as we start to realize how miserable our selves have made us. But it's also really hard to understand. And how do you integrate this idea that our ideas about the self are illusions, with the Western sense of the value of the individual, the soul, the importance of selfhood and achieving an identity, and all those sort of classic Western ideas. How do I put together the appeal of this idea of transcending the self with everything that I've learned up to now about the importance of the self and self-realization and all that? And there are a lot of different ways that this kind of works itself out, but one of the themes of the book that I think Blofeld kind of maybe helped me see was that you can discuss this in the abstract, or you can describe experiences that you've had, experiences that I call unselfing, when the normal boundaries of the self seem to dissolve, or you become aware of people have very different languages for explaining this or interpreting it. Is there no self? Is it a larger self? Is it a self with a capital S? They go in a lot of different directions, and they're different experiences that catalyze this experience of unselfing. Maybe it's participation in a ritual with other people, chanting, where the sort of sense of identification with others takes over. Maybe it's awareness of maybe you're looking down on your body and you feel, kind of like you've risen above it, or maybe the body seems to disintegrate and fall apart, or maybe trying to understand a koan, the mind just goes blank. Or, that. So anyway, I kind of follow what this experience of unselfing looks like. But the interesting thing to me is that even though these Westerners are taking seriously the more theoretical discussions of no self, like, monks write and Western philosophers, it's a much more experiential, personal account of what happened to me that helped me kind of get at least a glimmer of what this really means and how it affects life. I'm also really interested in what happens after this. And, you got to kind of go back to your ordinary life. And, it's tough to practice no self or feel like you've lost yourself anymore when suddenly your spouse is bothering you and you got to go to work and you this, that, and the other. And Blofeld is, people react in very different ways, and I'm interested in how they integrate these powerful experiences of unselfing with the rest of life. Blofeld himself was very sort of nostalgic and even unhappy that he couldn't kind of hold on to that. He felt kind of like a failure, that he had a glimpse, he had momentary glimpses of what it would be like to sort of go beyond the ego, I guess, with the self. But he couldn't stay there, and he sort of felt like, oh, geez, am I supposed to be trying harder, or what is it that I can't do to stay there? And that's one kind of response, which is very different from some other people who just accept that, nothing stays the same, and other Buddhist insights about impermanence or whatever help them maybe navigate that transition, even if they hold on to something that they glimpsed in a powerful moment. So that's another thing that's significant about Blofeld is his focus on this notion of no self, which I think becomes extremely important and is still a big part of my fascination with Buddhism and my continuing kind of puzzlement about how do I really, work this into the rest of my very Western life. Um, uh, just a couple other very quick things about Blofeld. One, um, I see a significant his encounter with many strands of Buddhism. He was most attracted in the end to Tibetan Buddhism, but he lived in Thailand for a long time, and he knew a lot about Mahayana Buddhism in China and Zen in Japan, and um, his the breadth of his knowledge of Buddhism is inspiring, and he's willing to throw himself into so many different traditions and see, first of all, see that Buddhism is a lot of different things, not just one thing, and to try them. And maybe this is a separate point. Many Westerners are attracted to Buddhism because, in contrast with Western monotheistic traditions that say this is what you have to believe or you have to take it on faith, Blofeld is kind of, I don't know if he's an originator of it, but he's right there at the beginning of an attitude that you see now often in uh, Buddhist teachers in the West, which is basically try it and see. If it works for you, go for it. If it doesn't work for you, try something else. And this kind of experimental, and again, grounded in personal experience. Don't take this on faith. Try it. See if it makes your life easier, if it eases the suffering. If it does, do a little bit more. Tweak it a little in this way. And that kind of light touch and that kind of appeal to experience, I guess, that I think Blofeld exemplifies to some extent, really becomes very characteristic of Western approaches to Buddhism, many of which are by, I don't know what to call them, seekers or people who are looking for spiritual meaning, kind of alienated from orthodoxies and institutions and I just think Blofeld taps into that and helps actually create a new kind of approach to religious experience in other traditions. And I see that the writing about this kind of, I guess I would call it spiritual autobiography, as that's one place that people hear about. I know several people who read Blofeld or Govinda back in the 70s, I guess, mostly, maybe late 60s. And that was all they knew about Buddhism. There were the dry academic tones, but they didn't encounter teachers. They encountered spiritual autobiographies, and that kind of turned them on to Buddhism. And then later on, they, maybe met teachers or became scholars, or then roshis and lamas and so forth came to the U.S. to teach. But this tradition of spiritual autobiography continues to provide really in-depth narratives of personal experience, as well as expositions of dogmas.